The afternoon had been quiet, almost too quiet, the kind that made time feel thick and slow. Margaret Hale stood alone in her kitchen, holding a warm mug of tea, listening to the ticking clock above the sink. At 59, she had learned how to live with silence. It filled her small house in Beaverton, Oregon, settling into corners where laughter used to be. She was not unhappy, but she was careful. Careful with her thoughts, careful with her heart. The rain had started early that day, light but steady, tapping against the windows like a soft reminder that the world outside was still moving. Margaret watched it fall on her front yard, on the rose bushes she had planted years ago with her late husband, Thomas. She kept them alive out of habit more than hope. They bloomed every year anyway. She had not planned for anything to happen. That day, there were no appointments, no visitors, no reason to expect change. That was why the knock on the door felt so sudden, so sharp. Cutting through the calm, Margaret frowned slightly and set her mug down. Few people came by unannounced. She walked to the door, her steps slow but steady, and opened it without thinking. Too much, a young man stood on her porch holding a medium-sized box. Rain clung to his dark jacket and his hair was damp, pushed back carelessly. He looked up and smiled, polite and professional, but also warm in a way that surprised her. "Good afternoon," he said. "Delivery for Margaret Hale." For a brief moment, Margaret forgot to answer. She was aware of the age difference immediately, not in a dramatic way, but as a fact. He was young, very young. Maybe mid-20s. She wondered if he noticed her. Hesitation. "Yes, that's me," she said at last. He handed her the small electronic pad to sign. His hands were steady, his voice calm. Nothing about him was rushed. When she returned the pad, he gave another smile. "Thank you," he said. "Have a good day." She took the box, nodded, and was ready to close the door. That should have been the end of it. It's just another delivery, another stranger passing through her life for a few seconds. But then he spoke again. "Sorry," he said, clearing his throat slightly. "I just wanted to say, your garden is really nice." Even with the rain, Margaret looked past him at the yard she rarely thought about anymore. No one had mentioned it in years. "Oh," she said, surprised. "Thank you." He nodded, as if relieved he hadn't crossed a line, then stepped back. "My name's Evan, by the way." "Margaret," she replied, though he already knew that. He turned to leave, walking down the path toward his van. Margaret stood there longer than necessary, watching him go, the rain blurring the edges of his figure. When she finally closed the door, the house felt different. Not louder, not brighter. Just less empty. She leaned against the door for a moment, confused by the tight feeling in her chest. It wasn't desire. It wasn't excitement. It was recognition. A reminder that she still existed beyond her routines. Margaret carried the box to the kitchen table and opened it. It was a practical item she barely remembered ordering. She set it aside and returned to her tea, but it had gone cold. She didn't drink it. The rest of the day passed, but her thoughts kept circling back to the knock. It's the smile, the simple kindness of a stranger who had seen her garden and, by extension, her. She told herself it was nothing. People were kind sometimes. I didn't mean more. That evening, she cooked dinner for 1 and 8, slowly, listening to an old radio station playing soft songs from decades past. Afterward, she washed the dishes and stood at the sink staring at her reflection in the dark window. She noticed the lines around her eyes, the silver in her hair. She was not ashamed of them. She just hadn't thought anyone else would notice her at all. She went to bed early, but sleep came late. Her mind replayed small details she wished she could forget. The sound of his voice, the way he had said her name without surprise or pity. She reminded herself of reality. She was 59. He was a delivery man passing through. Life was not a movie. The next morning, Margaret woke with a sense of restlessness she hadn't felt in years. She cleaned the house more than usual, rearranged. Books trimmed the rose bushes despite the damp air. She told herself she was just staying busy. Days passed. The memory of the delivery faded, or so she believed. Then, 1 week later, there was another knock. This time, her heart reacted before her mind. She knew the sound. She opened the door and found Evan standing there again, holding another box. "Well," he said with a small grin, "looks like I'm back." Margaret felt a brief rush of warmth. She didn't try to name. "I suppose you are." She signed again, their fingers brushing lightly by accident. It was nothing, but she noticed it. He did too, judging by the quick look he gave her before. Stepping back, "I didn't know if you'd remember me," he said. "I did." She replied honestly. They spoke for a few minutes longer this time. About the rain. About how delivery routes changed every week. About how her neighborhood reminded him of where he grew up in Washington State. The conversation flowed easily. Without effort, Margaret was careful with her words. She did not ask personal questions. She did not invite him in. She stood in the doorway, aware of the space between them and respectful of it. Before leaving, Evan looked at her yard again. "Those roses," he said, "they're strong. You must take good care of them." "They were my husband's favorite," she said before thinking. "I'm sorry." He replied gently, without asking more. That night, Margaret sat alone on her couch, staring at a framed photo on the shelf. Thomas smiled back at her from another. Time, she felt no guilt, only a quiet sadness mixed with something new. She wondered when noticing someone had become something she feared. Over the next few weeks, Evan delivered packages to her house several times. Not always hers, sometimes neighbors. But he waved when he saw her. Sometimes they talked. Sometimes they didn't. Each meeting stayed brief, respectful, safe. Yet each one left a mark. Margaret began to wait for the sound of the delivery van without meaning to. She scolded herself for it, but the feeling remained. It wasn't about Evan alone. It was about being noticed again, about the world opening just a little after years of closing in. One afternoon, Evan lingered longer than usual. "My grandmother lives alone," he said suddenly. "She says people stop seeing women after a certain age." Margaret stiffened slightly. "And do you agree with her?" He shook his head. "No, I think people just stop looking." She didn't answer. She didn't need to. The truth sat between them, heavy but honest. When he left that day, Margaret closed the door and rested her forehead against it. She felt shaken, not because anything inappropriate had happened, but because something meaningful had. A reminder that life could still surprise her, even if it didn't promise anything more. That evening, she sat at her kitchen table and wrote in a journal she hadn't opened in years. She wrote about rain, roses, and a knock on the door that had made her feel awake. She did not write his name. Outside, the rain fell again, steady and calm. Margaret watched it from her window, aware that something had begun, even if she didn't yet know what it was or where it would lead. The days following that brief conversation passed in a strange blur for Margaret. The sound of the delivery van rolling down her street became a heartbeat she didn't expect to feel. She told herself it was foolish. He was young, polite, and kind, that was all. Still, when Evan appeared again on her porch a week later, holding a small package, her chest tightened in a way that surprised her. "Hi, Margaret," he said, as if greeting an old friend. "Looks like I'm your regular delivery guy now." Margaret felt a flutter she couldn't name. She signed the pad without looking, aware of his steady presence. When she finally met his eyes, she saw recognition there too, as if he had noticed. Her noticing him, the rain had returned, lighter this time, falling in soft drops on the porch. "I suppose so," she said, smiling, though she felt slightly embarrassed by her reaction. Evan hesitated, then nodded. "I hope it's not strange that I say this, but I like seeing your garden. It feels peaceful, even with the rain." Margaret blinked. It was a simple statement, but the tone carried something she hadn't heard in years. Honesty without expectation. "Thank you," she said softly, unsure why she felt the need to answer at length. Their small talk stretched into minutes. The conversation flowed easily, natural, filled with observations about the weather, the neighborhood, and the few neighbors they both recognized. Margaret was careful not to ask personal questions, and he respected the unspoken boundaries between them. Yet, somehow, the distance felt smaller than before, though they remained separated by polite civility and the physical threshold of the doorway. "You remind me of my grandmother," he said quietly at one point, his voice steady. "The way you notice little things. She always says life is in the details." Margaret looked at him, caught off guard by the comparison. She didn't know how to respond, so she simply nodded. Words felt unnecessary. The next delivery came a few days later. Margaret had not expected him, but when she opened the door, Evan was there, holding a box with the same careful grip as before. He smiled at her, a small, genuine curve of lips that made her feel lighter somehow. "This is for you," he said, handing over the package. Their fingers brushed briefly. Fair. A spark of awareness passed through her, though she forced herself not to dwell on it. They spoke again about simple things. He mentioned his college classes, his love for reading, and the part-time work that brought him to her street. She listened with quiet attention, feeling a subtle pull she hadn't experienced in decades. Not romantic desire exactly, but a deep recognition that someone was noticing her, not pitying her. Not judging her, but simply seeing her. "You shouldn't say things like that," Margaret said softly, one day after he complimented her garden again. "People might misinterpret. I mean it respectfully," Evan replied. "I hope that's okay." Margaret nodded, though her chest felt tight. Respectful. That word stayed with her, echoing in her thoughts long after he left. Days passed, and then weeks. He stopped appearing as often. The routine she had come to anticipate slowed, and Margaret felt the absence in a way that surprised her. She had grown used to the subtle connection that had formed, the casual conversations, the polite smiles. Even the way he seemed to notice details in her life she had thought invisible, all of it left a quiet emptiness when it disappeared. She told herself it was for the best. He was young, and she was aware of the boundaries life demanded. She shouldn't wish for more. She shouldn't let her heart wander. But still, she found herself walking past the cafe near her house, hoping for a glimpse of him, even if she didn't intend to approach. Then, one rainy afternoon, she saw him. Evan sat at a corner table, coffee in hand, staring out the window. Margaret hesitated at the entrance, unsure if she should go in, unsure if he had seen her. But then his eyes lifted, and recognition lit up his face. Time seemed to slow for a moment. He stood immediately. "Margaret," he said, voice calm, steady, yet carrying something that made her heart beat faster. "I was hoping I'd run into you?" She smiled. It was simple, yet it conveyed everything she was feeling. Relief, curiosity, a quiet thrill. "I'm glad you did," she said. They sat together, careful to choose a table tucked in the corner, away from prying eyes. The conversation started as casually as it always had, about the weather, the town, the little changes in the neighborhood. But soon it deepened. They spoke about life in broader strokes. She told him about Thomas, about the house, about living alone, and the quiet that sometimes felt too heavy. He shared glimpses of his own life, his dreams, frustrations, the uncertainty of being young in a world that demanded so much too soon. Margaret noticed a tenderness in his attention. He listened without judgment. He didn't rush her. He asked questions that mattered, yet never pried. She realized how rare that was, to be truly seen without expectation, without pretense. "You make people feel noticed," he said softly, almost as if speaking to himself. "I don't think people realize how important that is." Margaret felt warmth spread in her chest. "And you make me feel younger," in a way, she admitted, careful with her words. Not in age, but in awareness, in noticing life again. Evan reached out his hand slightly across the table, just enough to acknowledge connection without overstepping. She noticed it but didn't pull away. The gesture was honest, simple, and somehow necessary. Time slipped by. The rain fell harder. Outside the world, a blur beyond the cafe's glass. And yet inside, two people at different stages of life found a rhythm they hadn't expected. Not romance as the world imagined it, but a quiet, profound recognition of one another's presence. As the afternoon faded, Evan stood. "I should go," he said reluctantly. "I don't want to overstay." Margaret nodded, feeling the familiar tug of emptiness return. She wanted to ask him to stay, to linger a little longer, but words failed her. "I hope I'll see you again," he said, a gentle hope in his voice. "You will." She replied almost automatically. He smiled, the kind. That left echoes in her mind long after he walked away. The cafe door closed behind him, and Margaret sat for a long time, staring out at the rainy street. She realized that she had been waiting for someone like this. Someone who could see her without judgment, someone who could remind her that life, even after decades of routine, could still surprise. The weeks that followed were quiet but charged with anticipation. Margaret continued her routines, but now they had a new dimension and openness to noticing, to hoping, to imagining. Every delivery van that passed her house brought a flicker of thought. Could it be him? Every smile from a stranger was met with curiosity rather than indifference. And then, one evening, she walked past the same cafe. There he was, sitting at the corner table once more. Their eyes met, and without a word, he rose, acknowledging the moment. Margaret felt a surge of emotion, a blend of longing and gratitude. They walked toward each other, to lives at different stages, aware of the boundaries and the possibilities. Neither knew exactly what the future held, but for the first time in many years, Margaret felt the quiet thrill of connection, a bond that defied age, expectation, and routine. Evan stopped beside her. "I didn't know if I'd see you again," he said softly. "You always find me." She replied with a smile that held more than words could convey. And in that moment, as the rain slowed outside and the cafe glowed warmly behind them, they both understood that something had begun, a story of recognition, of gentle longing, and of a quiet, enduring hope. Neither rushed forward, yet neither stepped back. Life had brought them together, and for now, that was enough. The future remained uncertain, full of questions, possibilities, and decisions yet to be made. But Margaret, for the first time in years, felt ready to face it, not alone, but seen, noticed, and understood by someone whose presence mattered more than she could have imagined. The world, once muted and predictable, felt suddenly alive again. Time would tell what would come next. But for now, the story existed in their shared glances, the brief conversations, the moments between deliveries, and the understanding that connection could bloom unexpectedly, even in the quietest corners of life. And as they walked together along the rainy street, Margaret realized that life, in its quiet way, still held surprises capable of stirring the heart at any age.